What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another episode of Lions Latest, going through the latest Detroit Lions news. And today, we have some Lions news to dive into. Now, behind camera, off camera, there are things that I'm definitely working on catching up on. There's still some things that we need to talk about. I'm pumped to get into the mock off seasons, but right now, I'm doing a lot of catching up on terms of draft prospects, doing a lot of watching into the background. So if we did like a draft video right now, it probably wouldn't be great. I did want to do videos after each Senior Bowl day. The issue is I just don't know enough about these players to really give good insight, and the stream would be pretty awful, I think, if that was the case. So I'm hoping that we do something like on Saturday for the Senior Bowl, and that we can react to that together. I can talk about what I've seen from these players from trying to catch up on a lot of them this week. I won't see all of them, but like the guys that I have went through, and we can watch that, kind of react to it, see who stands out. But the practices really didn't make a ton of sense for just where I'm at right now. However, the news is going to continue to pour in just because of where we're at. Free agency is next up. It's not far out. And, of course, then right after that, it's the NFL draft. So we're going to get to that stuff here pretty quickly. I'm just doing some catching up in the background. However, today we have some big coaching news for the Lions, as well as another little topic I'll sprinkle in there. So let's get it started. Welcome, everybody, to a video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, man, we are back with some more Lions news. Now, this news won't necessarily be breaking news for you, especially the big one that we're going to discuss, a new hiring by the Lions. Instead, you've probably heard of it. If not, well, we'll talk about that. But it's going to be more of a little bit of a breakdown on what I think he can add to the Lions, what he can maybe help us with defensively. But before we get to that, I first want to start off with Aaron Glenn. So the last couple of days we discussed Ben Johnson returning to the Detroit Lions, but Aaron Glenn was the other big domino. And to me, those were just the massive stories of the offseason. Like the extensions, those are going to be huge, but the re-signings, the free agency, the draft, I mean, those are all big in their own right, but that's not where the money's going to be made, I would say. It's going to be about what does that coaching staff look like. It's been the key. The Lions have put together an excellent coaching staff. Even if you just go back to last year, not even when Dan Campbell first got here, hirings like Scotty Montgomery as the running back coach, right? A guy that had been in consideration for a head coaching position. To add that piece from the Indianapolis Colts, that was a massive move for the Lions. So we've still had these assistants that have stepped in. Jim Hostler, who was a senior offensive assistant for us this past year. Like, we've had big-time assistant additions to this team. And another one was made today, which we'll talk about. But for Aaron Glenn, Washington was still out there as a head coaching vacancy until today, where it was announced that they're going to be hiring Dan Quinn from the Dallas Cowboys as their next head coach. So with that, Aaron Glenn, I guess, is just expected to now come back to Detroit for the 2024 season, as he wasn't hired for any of the openings as an NFL coach. I won't speak on that too much because I feel like I have the last couple of days, but like I have said, I will say quickly, I'm a big fan of Aaron Glenn. I am super pumped that this guy is back. I think if you're willing to go hire a defense coordinator that hasn't had a ton of, like, he obviously hasn't had head coaching experience, but maybe not just a ton of experience as a defense coordinator. Been 3 seasons. Every year we've improved. This past year was by far our best year. We also add more talent to that. That plays into this a lot. The example we're going to talk about today, the talent that you have on the roster is very important, and we'll discuss some of that. But I think he's done a really nice job. He does have defensive back coach experience as well, specifically the secondary coach, but he is now expected to be back with the Lions after not landing the job with Washington, and I do hate that for him. I know that he was looking for a spot, but I do think that those opportunities will continue to be out there as long as the Lions continue to be successful, especially if this defense continues to step in the right direction, right? There's a reason that he was voted the top coordinator in the NFL, as well as there's also the reason that teams were interviewing this guy when defensively we weren't that good statistically, yet teams still had interest in Aaron Glenn. I think from what we could see from the outside looking in, we talk about being a player's coach, a leader. I think he absolutely seems to check those boxes. So I think those opportunities will be there for him, and I hope they are going forward. But I will say this, man. I'm very happy to have Aaron Glenn back, man. Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson, two of the biggest dominoes this offseason to me, bigger than, the re-signings. Obviously, the extensions are going to be massive. The draft, they all are important. But the biggest thing was going to be about that coaching staff, and to get this guy back with Ben Johnson, oh my goodness, this is massive. And look, they both had their learning curves and their moments, and they're still going to have those, right? We talked about a couple, last week for Ben Johnson. With Aaron Glenn, I can remember at Seattle, for example, and it was like, wait a minute, we did the same thing twice, and then Seattle just exposed it, and they scored a touchdown. Like, there were frustrating moments, no question, with Aaron Glenn. But as we saw, once he got his cornerback back, which at that time in 2022 was Jerry Jacobs, we were much more solid and consistent at corner, and because that's statistically, especially against the pass, man, we took off. We were way better against the pass, and the whole defense took off. The second half of the season, our run defense locked in. It was like, okay, you can see the turnaround. I mean, look at the full stats. They don't look great. But if you just take the second half, you're like, you can see the turnaround. And obviously, the win started to tie along with that as well. And then heading into this season, not a perfect season statistically across the board in every category, but the run defense, one of the best in the league. We continue to take strides there. It was also the best pressure team that he has had statistically, according to Pro Football Reference. And it wasn't like he was blitzing out of his mind. He does like to blitz. We know that, right? He stays true to who he is. I mean, against San Fran, I was like, I don't know if I like the blitz. He was willing to blitz. So I was like, all right, we got you, Aaron Glenn. That's what you do. But I will say this, man. He got pressure on the quarterback, even though at times people questioned the personnel that we had, especially without a Lee McNeil. And he was able to create pressure. However he's able to do, he's able to create pressure for this defense. He has an identity. It doesn't always work perfectly. There are times where I question that he's trusting his players too much, putting them in spots where I'm just like, I don't know if I like that matchup. But he leaves them one-on-one. I'm like, I don't think I like that. Yet he does it. And it can come back to get us. But at the same time, that same trust that he has in a lot of ways that can be a little bit harder to point to unless things go wrong, I think is also a reason why there is so much success. And again, this stems down to Dan Campbell and his aggressive play calling. To me, I think Aaron Glenn takes a lot of those traits to the defensive side. Not necessarily just in aggressiveness. Obviously likes to blitz. It's not like a Wink Martindale kind of version or, you know, a Brian Flores type of thing. But I think it's also like kind of the mistakes. But you hear about it, right? When Aiden Hutchinson stunts inside and he gets kind of walled off and there was no one out there to deal with Fields and he runs to the end zone. We're like, what are we doing there? And then Aaron Glenn says, like, yeah, we give him the freedom to do that, right? So you trust the player on the spot. He puts a lot of trust in his players. Sometimes I don't love it. I think at times I'm like, I wouldn't leave him one-on-one. But that's what he does. That's how he does it. And the Lions have improved. So I give him that credit. He's had one of the stronger statistical seasons as a defensive coach within recent memory. And I'm just very pumped to get this guy back, man. I know Dan Campbell is fired up to get a guy like Aaron Glenn back. Both of these guys have been able to really grow. Like, we've seen mistakes, and I can remember when the hiring process happened, we talked about veterans, but we went with the young route, right? And not necessarily with Anthony Lynn initially, but now it's kind of went that way with Ben Johnson. These are young coordinators, man, that's have their bumps, but at the same time, they have really proven a lot of good. So I'm just excited to have both these guys back. I've seen the Super Bowl odd shifts. This means a ton for the Lions. So awesome to have him back. I'm rooting for him, especially if that's what he's looking for is that head coaching position. I would understand that. But for now, I'm pumped that Aaron Glenn is back as a Lion. To the next story that we have, and this is about Graham Glasgow. So now we're starting some of this free agency talk. Now, to me, we put up the list, and we did this on Bleacher Report. I put up the list of impending free agents for the Lions this offseason, unrestricted, restricted, exclusive rights free agents, and we just kind of looked at some of the names, kind of glanced over them, and I really pointed out the Josh Reynolds, right, the Jonah Jackson, right, two of the biggest unrestricted free agents, meaning they can sign wherever they want this offseason. And there wasn't a ton of, like, massive names. Now, there were guys, and I'm like, I'd bring him back, like Kendall Vilder. I'd have a lot of interest in bringing a piece like that back. You know, I don't expect that it would cost a ton. I like him for depth. You know, you can throw Jerry Jacobs into that category. I also, you know, James Houston, like, to me, there's no question you bring him back. He's on an exclusive rights deal. So, you know, again, you can get him at the minimum there. There's really no downside to it. You bring a piece like that back. Some of them felt very clear to me. And then one of those, honestly, was Graham Glasgow. Now, Graham Glasgow is in a different spot because he's not exclusive rights. He's not restricted. He's an unrestricted free agent. He's not the youngest guy in the world. He's one of the older unrestricted free agents that we have, especially outside of special teams. I mean, the guy is 31 years old, so he's not young necessarily at this point. But it also was very clear, and we talked about this, was like, hey, it's like non-negotiable. I'm making a call with Graham Glasgow immediately after the season over and just be like, hey, man, what's your interest? Do you want to play again? Because at the time I was thinking, well, maybe he'll want to retire. I don't know what his thoughts are off the field. I mean, where does he feel with that? Obviously, Big V was expected to be here, and unfortunately it didn't really work out. You know, you hate that for him. But Graham Glasgow stepped in, and where Graham thrived for us is not only was he just a good player, but he also played every position on the interior for us this year, and we know that history of flexibility is there, but he brought it to the Lions this season alone. And then obviously what Frank Ragnow had to say about him, how smart Graham Glasgow is. He's been around the league. The guy's played center. He understands it, so it helps a lot with Frank Ragnow as well. The athleticism that he brought, right? The wide rushing scheme. I thought his ability just to get on the front side of defensive tackles, street techniques, the quickness off the ball. Like, he was an elite run blocker this year. In a lot of ways, he was a great run blocker and very consistent as a run blocker. Now, pass pro would have his ups and has its downs statistically, especially. He wasn't perfect in pass protection, but the flexibility, the run blocking, the FBI that he brings to the position, like, to me, it was like, hey, you got to make a call to that guy. And now last year, we kind of had him on a bargain deal, to be honest. 1 year, $2.75 million, up to $4.5 million. We had him on a great deal. And Graham Glasgow made it clear, like he wants more money after this season. He thought that this this was one of his 1 or 2 best seasons that he's played. When we signed him, we were like, okay, that's good depth. It was like, oh no, that's actually the guy. Like Graham Glasgow's going to be the guy. And man, you never really looked at it as like, oh dang, okay, we got to back up. Like you just looked at him as a starter because he produced and played and performed like a starter would. But, you know, he wants more money after the season that he feels like he put out there. Also, again, the age does play a little bit of a factor here if you're looking, I guess, long-term, but I don't think it would be that. At most, maybe a 2-year deal for a guy like Graham Glasgow. But he is looking for a little bit more money. And I guess, according to him, the Lions talked to him immediately, and, you know, they would love to have Graham Glasgow back. So it makes a ton of sense. Like, that doesn't shock me at all. The Lions would be like, hey, great season. You know, we'd like to have you back. And obviously, they're going to have those conversations. Now, where does that number fall? There's so much that goes into these contracts. And he's a little bit older makes this interesting because, like a Nate Erdbig, who got signed this offseason, didn't really have the playing experience like Graham, but he's much younger. I think he was 24. So it was like, okay, there's, you know, we can see what the future is going to be here. He didn't, I don't think, play that much this year, but he signed like a 2-year, $8 million deal. But I think he falls closer maybe to some of the 2022 deals that we saw given out, whether that was a guy like Roger Saffold, who signed the 1-year, $6 million deal. I think something like that's kind of interesting. Or at Andrew Norwell, 2 years, $10 million deal after the season that he was coming off of. Maybe somewhere in that range where we're talking like $5 to $6 million per season, right? Kind of that average type of number. So definitely a bump from last year. It's not up to 4.5, but like that's kind of where we're setting things. Maybe a tad higher, but I think the Lions would be willing to do that. This to me is a no-brainer. Unless he's looking for something crazy where it's like I want 12 a year or something, like, or I want 9 a year. I would struggle, I think, a little bit with that, especially if it's too many years and we have too many like guarantees towards it. But like a 2-year, $10 million deal, something like that, 2 years, maybe $11 million, like something like that makes a ton of sense to me. And I think that's probably where his deal is going to fall, somewhere in that category. Maybe it's another 1-year deal, but he wants a little bit of a pay raise, and that I think that's very understandable based on what he did for us and the flexibility that he gave us. And again, I don't think the Lions, if there's a position, I don't think they're going to go cheap on offensive linemen because they also have a decision to make with Jonah, and that could play a factor in this as well. Again, I said in that Stream of Bleach Report, don't be shocked if Jonah does get a new deal. I know on here we've kind of talked about like, oh man, he's inconsistent, I wouldn't pay the guy. This is just kind of a quick note. First off, that position usually doesn't get paid a ton. You know, now he's in a little bit of an interesting position because he's just coming off of his rookie deal. But we have seen from Jonah is this year he did improve in pass pro, and that's been the most inconsistent, I think, part of his game statistically. Like this season, he allowed, I believe it was 24 pressures. Now, of course, he missed some time, but I thought he improved there. It was a little bit better. It wasn't like massive improvements, but it was better. And that's always been the inconsistent thing with Jonah. But he adds athleticism, he adds flexibility to our offensive rush scheme, which I think makes us so dynamic, makes us so tough as an offense. He's been a solid run blocker. You could argue this year was a little bit of a down year for him, but he's been solid throughout his career, so I almost expect there to be consistency there. It's just about taking steps as a pass protector. Missing time, I don't know where his contract falls. Maybe it's a little bit heavier, right? Could it push into the 3-year, $16.5 million type of deal, or a Hernandez 2-year kind of $9 million deal, sort of in kind of the Graham Glasgow range? I would think it'd be a little bit more than that because of his age. It also could be much more long-term, pushing like a 3-year. I think if they get it at a reasonable price, I don't know if it gets up to the 10 or the $12 million a year. I don't know if it pushes that. Maybe it does. I mean, maybe it does. And I don't know if the Lions will be completely interested in that. But again, I don't think the Lions are pressed to go cheap at that spot. I think they're very okay with saying that, okay, we like these guys. It's about extensions. Let's bring these guys back, all right? Let's get these guys under contract. Let's take care of that offensive line, especially if they feel like things are going the right way. So let's talk about this hiring that the Lions made, and it was announced today. Now, this name may sound familiar, especially if you've been keeping up with the Senior Bowl, because this is the head coach of the American team at the Senior Bowl. So that is kind of like a little inside track that the Lions, in a way, are getting here by hiring this coach, because he's getting hands-on work. We saw the first season for the Lions, they had an opportunity to work the Senior Bowl, and they felt like it gave them an advantage to work with the guys hands-on. And in this case, the Lions are kind of getting that. There's the Lions a nice little inside scoop, and I think that's a cool little benefit towards this hiring. I don't think that's why the hiring was necessarily made. I mean, maybe it was, but I think they just wanted to add this coach. Now, we'll have to keep an eye on the current defensive line coach position, because last year the Lions added a new defensive line coach after losing Todd Wash, I think Todd Wash was great. I mean, from the outside looking in, Todd Wash's background was really strong as well, where he had been in the past, the resume that he had built. And then this offseason, the Lions had went out and signed and hired a new defensive line coach, John Scott Jr., for the first time. So they went a different direction. They went kind of young there, and maybe this, means that John Scott Jr., he may not be here going forward. There's a chance that I don't want to speak on that because I don't know. We saw Mark DeLone, for example. Remember the linebacker coach he was moved on from. They stepped in Kelvin Shepard to that role. So there could be a chance that takes place with the Lions here. But Terrell Williams has tons of experience, and I think when you start to look at what he brings to the table, I mean, he's been a part of some very good defensive line groups, and I just went back to like his last 4 stints and where he's been, the development, I think at the college level it can speak a lot of volumes because it can be a little bit easier to track, like, okay, as a freshman, right, what did this guy turn into every year that he was there? Where was the growth, right, transfers versus the NFL, which when you start to especially look at like team statistics, it can be very difficult because now, and I guess transfers still impactful. I guess it was a little bit different when he was coaching at the college level, but like in the NFL, man, it is really about the players that you have, right? I mean, it is really about that. Now, for the Lions, it's almost like they're kind of trying to run this a little bit like a college team, especially in the past where there wasn't like a tons of transfers, because it's like, hey, we want to add you, right? And then you're going to spend your 4 years here like a college player, and then we want to extend you if you earn it. Like, they're almost trying to treat it like that program to have that consistency so they can have that growth within their players, right? They like to have those guys that they're comfortable with, and they are absolutely set out to do that. Like, they are set up to do that. What Brad Holmes set out to do is absolutely how they are set up. They don't have a ton of guys under contract, but they have the cap space. A lot of their best players are under contract for next season. What they set out to do, which was, hey, we want to re-sign our guys. Like, they told us that from day one. It's not about big splash signings of free agency. We may get some nice little deals here, but it's about giving guys a chance, and then it's about re-signing our guys that earn it. And my goodness, they are absolutely in the spot to do that. Again, I don't think this free agency is going to be about all these splash moves. I think we may get a couple. I think there may be, especially at specific positions, maybe it is like pass rusher to go get a veteran pass rusher to kind of slide into that mix, especially because of where your draft pick is sat. That you're late now. I mean, unless you trade up, you have 2 third-round picks. Because you're so late in the draft, that the Lions could be looking at it like, okay, maybe let's try to get a guy that can absolutely play now. But at the same time, for the Lions, it's going to be about the extensions. A majority of it, to me, is going to be about extending these players this offseason, and that's a good thing. Brad has told us that. It's not always about, like, hey, the guys that you signed outside the building, because a lot of these guys are still unrestricted, like Josh and Jonah. I mean, just 2 examples there. These guys unrestricted. They're available to everybody, not just us. Everybody can get in on that. Who is Terrell Williams? Well, let's start there first. He has been hired as our defensive line / run game coordinator. And again, John Scott Jr. was our defensive line coach. So again, something's going to happen there. But as a run game coordinator, I point out here, we didn't actually have like a run game coordinator last season. We had it. I believe it was Todd Wash, and then Wash left. Then John Scott Jr. was hired. He was the defensive line coach. So we didn't really have a run game coordinator. Now, again, that's just kind of the title. Okay, it didn't seem necessary. We ran the ball pretty well. We also stopped the run pretty well. But we also did sign Scotty Montgomery, or hire Scotty Montgomery. I keep saying sign, the running back coach. And he had a lot of experience in the past. So I think he probably eased to some of that as well. Now you get Ben back. I think that helps too. And I will say where he's coming from, which is most recently the Tennessee Titans, going back to 2018. He was their assistant head coach / defensive line coach. And obviously they've had changes take place this offseason, mainly with Mike Vrabel. So it makes sense that he would, go to this spot. And again, I think he's obvious. If I'm a coach, I would be looking at what the Lions just did and being like, yo, this is my opportunity. I mean, Ben's getting interviews. Aaron's been getting interviews. Like, this team's winning. If I want to get an interview, and he had done things in the past. He had went to an academy in the past to kind of learn about taking over the head coach position. And one of the things that I read about him that I did love was kind of his acknowledgement of, like, I went there, like, just thinking, as an assistant, like, oh, I would do this, I would do that. He said, and then he went through the academy. He was, like, one of 26 coaches to be invited. And he was like, okay, I'm not ready to be a head coach. Like, I'm not ready for that responsibility right now. But I'm sure he may still have that interest in mind long term. And if you're landing on a team like this and you're winning football games, you're going to get interest. Like, it just happens. You're going to get interest, and it happens fast. And again, he already has a lot of the good background that already holds a lot of weight right now. So this is a guy that's a former nose tackle as a player. He played with East Carolina in college. And in his coaching career, I'll read through the first few, won't go too deep into those. There are a couple of connections that are extremely interesting when looking at how Terrell Williams connects with the Lions. First off, of course, you probably heard about the Dan Campbell one with the Miami Dolphins, and we'll touch on that. It wasn't a huge stint, but for a little bit there was some overlap there. But also, there was a connection to Brad Holmes in a very strange way. So just looking through where he's coached in the past, after Fort Scott for a season, he then moved to North Carolina A&T. And if that name sounds familiar, now, unfortunately, as Lions fans, we don't get the opportunity to witness our team in the Super Bowl. But man, I'm feeling really good about next year. However, there is only one game left this NFL season. So you might as well take advantage of that opportunity. And the best way to be in the know about this year's Super Bowl, it's the last game of the season, right? I mean, it's still one more football game. I mean, no one wants the season to end. So with this one last football game, let's take advantage. Let's understand what's going on. And the best way to do that is over here on BetUS NFL Picks and Prediction. Super Bowl 58 is next weekend. If you want some inside info and picks advice from award-winning sports bettors before the big game, go over to BetUS Picks and Predictions channel on YouTube, or hit the link in the description. They have you covered. It is where Brad Holmes went to college, North Carolina A&T, and there would have been an overlap there as Brad Holmes played on the defensive line. He was a 4-year letterman. He was also a champion there and voted the team captain in 2001. What years did Terrell Williams coach there? 1999 to 2001. So there is an absolute crossover as the defensive line coach. So he directly worked with this guy. And again, being voted team captain, I'm sure Brad Holmes was well liked, probably by Terrell Williams as well. So there's a clear-cut connection there when Brad Holmes was a player. Very weird, but there you go. That's the first connection that we have. That's really the main thing that I want to touch on there. Then he moved to Youngstown State, Akron, and then he began coaching Purdue. And when you look at the list of where he's coached, he's been a defensive line coach everywhere he's been. I mean, he's always been a defensive line coach. So clearly that's been his specialty here with Purdue from 2006 to 2009. And obviously he was given a lot of credit for the development that he had within some of the top players. I mean, some of the top players in the country. Now, as you can see, I highlighted some of their key contributors specifically on the defensive line year to year. And I think what you really want to look for here is first off players year after year and see where their statistical production goes. Also, what I highlighted in yellow is very key because these are team statistics. Now, we know a lot more plays into this than just the defensive line. Linebackers, safeties, corner. I mean, anybody can get a sack that's on the defensive side of the ball. But you can see statistically there consistently was basically in the top 50 in college football in every year with Purdue outside of being 53rd with 1.9 sacks per game in 2008. Consistently one of the top sack teams in the nation per game. And you can see that while some of the run defensive stats took a little bit of a step back after the year before he got there, which is 2005 before he got there, you can see individually some of the players that he helped and he worked with that developed and just took off. Whether that was Spencer, 10 sacks, 26.5 tackles for loss. Cliff Averill, who really came along after not being statistically that productive in 2005, came along in 2006 for a very productive season. You also see on here Bright, kind of keep an eye on that name as well. And again, 2.2 sacks per game, top 50 in the country. You move on to 2007, look where Bright's stats go. 6 sacks from 0, also a tackle for loss. Again, Cliff Averill continuing to take steps forward. Really a similar type of season in terms of tackles for loss in sacks and sacks as well. But as a team, in terms of run defense, their stats got a lot better here. About 43 yards less per game allowed. Also, the yards per carry dropped by almost a full yard. Then you also insert Ryan Kerrigan to this mix. You can also see Neal, keep an eye on Neal there as well. But Ryan Kerrigan then gets inserted into this mix, and he was statistically one of the best college football players just in terms of a pass rusher alone. But also 31st in the country, 2.6 sacks per game. You move on to the next season then in 2008, and that's where you see Ryan Kerrigan take off for them. 7 sacks. Also notice here Neal, you can see the jump that he took, 5.5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. You can see McGee as well on this list. You start to get Gooden into the mix a little bit here. Now, as a team, it dropped a little bit, just outside the top 50. But then in his final season with Purdue, another strong finish there, 4.4 yards per carry. So, solid in those numbers. Not great, but Kerrigan absolutely took off. He was great. High draft pick. Neal again continuing to get more and more productive. Werner steps into the fold there. He's very productive. Now, Terrell Williams, he has been around. So he's worked with all different types of body types, and we'll get to another player later that kind of reminds me of someone that might be on our roster. However, when you start to look and point to some of these specific names and what he was a part of, you could see before he got there, this was a university that was known for just putting out defensive ends. And there were some very successful defensive ends, specifically at the top, Ninkovic, I think I'm saying that right, who spent his career with the New England Patriots, very successful. But I think when you first moved to 2006, obviously Cliff Averill stands out. But a guy like Anthony Spencer, the statistical production, he just took off in his first season with Terrell Williams. And in that season, it was the senior season. It ended up leading to him being a pretty high draft pick. So you had that. Of course, you see how Ryan Kerrigan and Cliff Averill, those guys developed. Cliff Averill's one of those guys, kind of a tweener, right? Edge rusher, defensive end. Can he play on the end? But he had a lot of that athleticism. And obviously, we have a few of those guys, not to that complete sense, right, that are kind of tweeners. Are they a 3-4 outside linebacker? Are they a 4-3 end? And he had dealt with a lot of those types of pieces. Then you also have kind of some of the movement parts that they also had here. So a guy like Bright, as you see his statistics really jumped up. Now, unfortunately, there was some off-the-field stuff, so you don't see any numbers there for that 2008 season. They were expecting to have him that year, and that did not happen. But he took off as he continued to grow and develop, and that's why that 2007 season was so statistically productive, meaning that in 2008, a guy like McGee, who ended up changing positions, I believe part of that was due to the situation that took place with Bright because they did not have him. They were expecting to have the senior. So you have a guy like McGee who was able to switch positions. You see statistically, again, productive, very productive. And when you start to move on to some of these top players that he's worked with defensively, just specifically here with Purdue, again, the tweeners stand out, the Ryan Kerrigans, right, 6'4", pushing 270. A lot of people compared him to Aiden Hutchinson and his body type, right, the hand usage, the strip sack specialist. I think Hutchinson has already proved a ton in the NFL, but that'll be good to have that kind of body type to work with, though Hutchinson is a much better athlete, I will say that. But then he's also worked with even some of the, questions on size in the interior, right? He's worked with some big dudes in the interior that you're like, yeah, multi-gap. But then he's also worked with the guys like Mike Neal here. Again, statistically productive, but looked at as undersized, under 300 pounds, maybe can't handle double teams, and they found roles for all of these guys. So that's what stands out first off here with Purdue, is working with the tweeners, specifically by position, dominant, and honestly, some of the best careers between Cliff Averill and Ryan Kerrigan. As many good DNs they put out, he was part of the development, especially with Kerrigan and Cliff Averill, of some of the best ends that we've seen in terms of some of the most recent history that they had put out at that position. He was working with the best, arguably, of that group. So that's what stands out when I look at this. Quickly kind of move through college. So then we move on to Texas A&M. Now, this is a very short stint here. Obviously, the key name is working with Von Miller. Now, in a way, it's like, yo, that's Von Miller, though. Give him some credit, but Von Miller was a dog, clearly, statistically, before the dude even got there. 17 sacks, 21 and a half tackles for loss. Like, yeah, that's pretty good. All right, he did pretty good, okay? Now, you may have saw it a little bit the last graphic, but I do think it's very getting clear here how he worked with some of those stand-up outside linebackers that would rush on the end, right? Not necessarily your pure defensive ends. Clearly, that's the case with Von Miller. And I don't want to throw James Houston in the same body type because Houston doesn't have the same length. He's also only 6'1", but he is 240. Von Miller came out about 245. But you also have to keep in mind another name on here, DeMontre Moore. He was another player that right before we ended up seeing Williams leave, he was playing as a stand-up outside pass rushing edge defender. Now, he transitioned when the new head coach stepped over and he became a defensive end. But before he did, he was playing in the same Von Miller role, just backing up Von Miller. And then he took off, of course, Von Miller left. So I think that's, again, very interesting. You look at a piece like James, potentially new pieces as well, but being very comfortable with playing, especially very comfortable working with the guys that have to play in that stand-up role, rush from that spot, but also be able to play the run. Finding a really good fit, a guy that can play underneath zone. He played some of that role. So again, I just think that's interesting. He's had a lot of experience working with that type as well. The first season that he was there, you can see a little bit of the numbers dropped a little bit there for Von Miller, and you can see the sacks per game did drop a little bit as well, but they're pretty similar to what it was before he got there. Obviously, the talent was a little bit different in that sense as well. And Bass, I point out that name specifically. The guy wasn't even on the team in 2009, so again, to be able to step back onto the team and then have any kind of production, I think is impressive. To his final season with Texas A&M, and obviously, again, the talent's pretty good. It has been at Texas A&M, but this isn't like what they maybe have now, and you can see that without Von Miller in the mix, you see more stepping into a massive role. Gerard Eddy takes over a big role with 5 sacks. Bass improves 2 sacks, 4.5 tackles for loss. You see Neely continue to improve. And then as a team, 3.9 sacks per game was first by a landslide in the country. And I think that's what's very easy to notice when you just look at those. That's why I just stuck to the numbers there for college, because it's very easy to just kind of demonstrate that what college is, what college especially then with, again, all the transfers, it's like, yo, can you take a guy that's a freshman and develop them along the way? Like, can these guys continue to improve and replace kind of what you're losing? And what you see is consistency in terms of sack numbers. You're also seeing guys step into massive roles that they had to fill, and also being a part of some of the best pass rushers that we've seen in the NFL. Ryan Kerrigan, Von Miller, Cliff Averill. He was a part of all those guys as well, man. We're going back with some names there. Now, moving on to the NFL side of things, this is where things get real interesting. I do have some more numbers to this. On the left side, it's just the statistics and how they produce statistically. But then on the right side, I listed individual players that I think we can talk about. Again, with the Raiders, it was Oakland Raiders at the time. Again, they didn't have, he didn't have a ton of time there. And I also put 2011 so you could see where statistically kind of where they started at, right? 5.1 yards per carry, 27th in yards per game, worst in the league in expected points added versus the run. Now, what's key about this is I don't put as much emphasis on some of the statistics. Reason being is because, as we know in the NFL, like, yes, you want to continue to improve. Again, defensive line doesn't do all of this either, but there's also an aspect of, like, depending on when you're stepping into that organization, where's their talent level at? Did they just go lose their best player to free agency? Like, those things are very impactful. Is the roster building in the NFL a little bit different than what college was, especially going back over 10 seasons. But you can see the statistics through the years, and they were really strong here with the Oakland Raiders, especially against the run. They just continued to get get better and better seemingly against run. They were a very good team against run defensively. Tackles for loss, for whatever reason, statistically, always a high number seemingly with Terrell Williams. So we'll also keep that in mind as well, just, making plays in the backfield against the run. But then you start to move on some of these players individually. I'll only focus on a few of them here. You can see Houston on the right side at the top, right, one of their edge rushers that they had. And you can see where the pressures went when he got there. 54 pressures according to PFF. That was up 20 from the year before. The next season, working with the Raiders, 63 pressures. That was the most in his career. You can also see as well with Bryant, 35 pressures in 2012, most of his career. They also had some real veterans there. Seymour, who was in his final season as well, just kind of to point that out. Again, Carter was kind of a role player that was added into that mix as well there. Kelly, another role player last year in Oakland specifically. Standout players, right? Advance Walker, 41 pressures. That's his most in his career by 21 pressures. Jason Hunter, he was in his final season. Pat Sims, you can see again statistically the jump that he made first season 2013, 24 pressures, the most at the time by 10. Some older veterans that were a part of the mix here. You'll see this a little bit better with Tennessee and kind of their ability to just develop guys and where that defensive line room is really at right now. Also, I did throw in some of their draft picks that they had as well. A 6th-round rookie season. He had his best season with the Raiders in his career. It was a short career, but he had his best season with the Raiders in 2013 statistically. You have Stacey McGree here, 6 pressures in his first season as a 6th-round pick. That's solid. You'll take that. Now, he had 0 in his next season, but he only played about 100 snaps. And then he moved to 2014. Again, they get more vets into the mix. They add Justin Tuck towards the tail end of his career. This is when they draft their premier pass rusher in Khalil Mack, and he was just incredible, right? So, I'm not going to, he was incredible. 54 pressures, 90 run grade. CJ Wilson, again, a lot of these role players having some of the best seasons of their career. 12 pressures, most. Okay, that was the best season that he had in his career. Benson, I think, is a standout name to look at here. Reason being is that he was a rookie that was added by Seattle initially that they moved off of after a season. He goes to the Raiders, and he doesn't play a ton, but look at the numbers that he put up in 2014. Nearly an 80 run grade, 14 pressures after being just let go by the Seattle Seahawks. So you see a lot of the role players that were able to have some of their best seasons, take massive jumps, specifically in their ability to get pressure, is what you notice there with the Raiders.
The couple players I want to focus on here, first off, is Lamar Houston. You're going to see him number 99 at the bottom of your screen. Now, he was listed at like 300 pounds coming out of the draft, and ultimately now he's listed at like 270, 275. So he kind of has that big DN stylistic build. He reminds me of John Kaminsky a little bit when I watch him play, but he played like a full-on outside linebacker edge rusher role, and obviously statistically he was super productive. So there were some changes in terms of the role they asked him to play, but it definitely worked for the better there, especially as a pass rusher. With that being said, the other guy I want to focus on is going to be at the top of your screen, and this is going to be Benson. Now, he looks a little bit bigger than James Houston, but listing-wise, he was listed at like 6'2", 240. I think he's pushing 250, probably bulked up a little bit, but this is a guy that, similar to James Houston, they found a role for him. He played opposite of Mack. This was not like some high draft pick. He was a 6th-round pick, and he was very overlooked, but he found production within this Raiders defense. They were able to find a way. Like James Houston, who plays off the 4 technique in a spot like this, he plays on the end. This was another guy that, hey, if a 4-man front, you're going to have to play one-on-one with a tackle. And they were able to get really good production on a Benson opposite of Khalil Mack. The Lions, I think, really recognize what they have in potential in terms of opposite of Hutchinson, and they know that, man, there's really something there. Now, they may add to that, but if we're also looking at some of the edge rusher position, there hasn't been a ton of like guys that have really taken over that role. Obviously, James Houston, it was mainly because of injury this year, but opposite of Hutch, right? You had Charles Harris, who had a solid year the year before, didn't really stand out this year. Julian Okwara was kind of on and off. Romeo Okwara, they tried to find something there, returning from an injury, kind of died out a little bit towards the end of the year. Finding that guy opposite James Houston showed so much promise, and they were able to take a guy here that was listed at like 240 and give him a real natural spot on this front, man, and he looked good. And I also just kind of point out Stacey Morgan because, again, he fits into a similar role to Kaminsky, those kind of guys, Josh Paschal, the guys that can play that role as the big DN. And, their main role was, man, they stopped the run, but they held up against linemen, and it allowed those guys to rush. Lions have something there, and I think they would love to try to take advantage of what they have with James Houston.
Now, there is a key name here. We move on to the Dolphins and his next stint here. First off, obviously, this is the connection with Dan Campbell. So Dan Campbell became the interim head coach here with the Miami Dolphins. He was here before this. He was the interim head coach 2015. That was his last year before going to New Orleans, before becoming an assistant coach. So he wasn't here every year that Terrell Williams was here. However, there was that connection, and on top of that I will point out, if you look at the bottom, in 2017, his last season, they drafted Charles Harris. And again, we can speak to this because we've seen this up close, right? We've seen this up close and personal. Charles Harris is a Lion. Statistically speaking, before he went to Detroit, right, a lot of people looked at him as a bust. There was a reason that we signed him to the price tag that we did as a 4th and 1st round pick. However, he wasn't really labeled as a bust until his seasons after Terrell Williams left, right? And then after a year, he was moved on to the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, statistically, he was really solid as a rookie. He didn't play a ton, but he was really solid. And after that, he was kind of just recognized as a bust. He was moved on from. The statistics just dropped. But in his rookie season, he wasn't bad. He was a later-round first pick. He was picked right after Jared Davis. So, I just thought that was a little interesting note to make. And now when you move on to the Dolphins stint, again, some of the veterans, Olivier Vernon, the pressures that he put up, right, the improvements that he made there, his first season there, 81 pressures versus 48 the year before. They also had Cameron Wake as well. You could see some of the numbers that he posted there in terms of pressures created. You don't really count 2015 because he only played about 200 snaps. They also signed Ndamukong Suh that first year that he joined Miami, and again, that was, from the Detroit Lions. And once he joined there, he had his best run grades of his career. Pressure-wise, he was pretty great, like he had been all in his career up to that point. So that's kind of that splash down. You're expecting things to go well, so that's understandable. It's kind of why I'm focused on a little bit more of the role pieces kind of side of this, like a guy like Shelby, right?
Shelby was another guy, Derek Shelby, who was listed as kind of a tweener. He was an undrafted free agent, 6'2", 280. Where's the guy going to play? And they found a role for kind of that big defensive end with this piece.
2015, 41 pressures. That was the most in his career by 20 pressures, okay? He also had his best run grade. He played 800-plus snaps for them defensively. Moore, this is an interesting name. This was a piece that he actually had worked with in college. They added him. He didn't really play that much, but I just thought it was interesting that it was a piece that he had worked with directly, and they had added him at one point just for depth specifically.
And this is where, as a Lions fan, I think you should draw some real inspiration. Jordan Phillips. Now, a lot of people will probably know him much better now as the Buffalo Bills. Again, this is a former second-round pick. However, he started with Miami Dolphins, and the reason I bring this up is because this guy was listed at 6'5", 300 pounds, 34-inch and 3/4-inch arms coming out of the draft. Does that sound familiar to a guy that was listed at 6'4.5", 330 pounds, 35-inch arms out of Western Kentucky, right? 1 round difference. I think it's very interesting. Guy that didn't play a ton this past season, but we saw with Jordan Phillips and the real improvements that he made before, again, the outburst and then being let off the team and now being with the Buffalo Bills. This was a guy that, again, similar in terms of build. It was a slow growth, but it was a growth, right? And he found a role there. He was questioned in terms of could he get pass rush production? Could he continue to keep his pad level low? But what they loved was his effort, his energy, right? That relentlessness that we know that we have a guy in Braddock Martin that he'll bring that as well. He would make flashes. You want to just speak to, again, similarly body types? This is a guy that, again, fits that mold very similar to a player that we drafted this past season.
Who was a second-round pick. Ultimately, that was waived, but he was their starting defensive tackle. You can see statistically the improvements that he made year 1 to year 2 to year 3. They were really strong pressure-wise, and then he was let go by the team again after Terrell Williams left. Apparently, there was an outburst on the sideline. He wasn't happy about his playing time. That may have not been avoided if Terrell Williams was still there. It's still the same thing could have potentially happened. But what I'm saying is he performed well, and then it just kind of fell apart once Terrell Williams left. Then he started moving to 2016. Again, big note here that I read about Andre Branch. He was noticed as, he's not much of a pass rusher, but he can set the edge. And this is when they started to lose some of that veteran depth, so they brought him in as kind of just depth for the defensive end spot. And in his first season there, 46 pressures. That was his most by 16 in his career. Next season, another strong pressure rate, which would have been second based on that statistic, 31 pressures that year, okay? Again, more veterans into the mix, and this would make sense that the Lions could follow this pass, potentially keep an eye on them doing this in free agency. Maybe not a massive deal, but maybe adding a veteran to add depth, specifically like behind a guy like James Houston. Jason Jones, Mario Williams was in that mix as well. And then as I touched on, they also added Charles Harris to the mix. Now, statistically speaking here, wasn't great kind of in 2016 against the run. But again, what does stand out when you look at these numbers, quarterback hits were always better every year that he was there. Tackle for loss is usually consistently at a pretty solid number. It's usually consistently not at the bottom of the league. The yards per carry did fluctuate a little bit. Again, 2016 wasn't great, but by the time he left, it definitely settled in a little bit there. The sack numbers were definitely not crazy, but the quarterback hits were an improvement. So that's something there. And now most recently with the Tennessee Titans, and this is where he's had his longest, stint, right? 2018 to 2023, where he was then labeled as also an assistant head coach for them. And you start to look at what took place here, man. I think what stands out to me is when you just kind of see the defensive line unit and really the final couple years and you just look at the names versus where you saw that kind of come along when Terrell Williams was there. I mean, you look on the left side of the screen statistically, and you're going to see that, it's not the best, especially early. Look at 2020. That's not a great stat line at all. 4.5 yards a carry, 120 yards per game, 23rd in expected points added. But what you also notice, because you can see before he got there, run defense really good, took a step back, right, kind of settled back in 2019 to a top 10 run defense, and then it kind of dropped off. But what you do see there is in those last couple of seasons, right, 2021, 2022, 2023, consistently one of the best run defenses in football, right? You also see the sack numbers begin to rise a little bit as well. 43, 39, 45. The quarterback hits are pretty darn high. The tackles for loss are not bad either, especially in his final season. So you start to see real consistency kind of settle in, and it felt like that at that point, that group had really kind of molded together and was like, all right, here's our guys, man. We weren't just plugging in some of the old vets, and it was like, we got you. We already kind of know what you are. There you are. It was like, all right, these young guys are now taking over. And obviously some of it, like, yeah, I mean, he's a first-round pick. You'd expect him to be there, but you still got to give the guys some credit for that. Right side, I did showcase some of the young guys and kind of how their statistics just evolved a little bit over the years, right? Some of the young guys that he got to work with, not necessarily Daquan Jones, but you can see the numbers kind of consistent in terms of pressures created. Austin Johnson was one of the young additions to this defense, 23 years old in 2017, and you can see kind of the numbers and some of the growth over the years. He was only there from 2016 to 2019, so he wasn't there extremely long, but you can see in his final season was his strongest year with the Tennessee Titans. Guys that have been able to just kind of give me some sort of role if they're not the biggest deals, right? Not necessarily like the old veterans, but guys that we just have, like maybe he was a practice squad piece, maybe he was let go by someone else. I think of John Kaminsky, I think of Charles Harris. Like being able to get production out of those does stand out. I think when you just look at the numbers alone, they then added Harold Landry to that mix, one of their pass rushers, kind of a stand-up in their 3-4 defense, right? About 250 pounds, and you can see the numbers and how those improved over the years with Tennessee, 34 to 54 pressures, 51, 64, 47. Obviously, he's a huge pressure piece for this defense. Then also you start to get some of these big names that start to come along, and that's where you start to really focus, I think, on some of the development, right? The Jeffrey Simmons, who is just an absolute animal, one of the best in the game right now. He was a rookie in 2019. You could see by the numbers, those are his pressures by season. They continue to really just kind of skyrocket after his rookie season there. Obviously, now he's getting paid a ton of money. Jeffrey Simmons is an absolute animal, one of the best. What stands out also about a guy like Jeffrey Simmons is he's not like completely massive. I mean, the guy's like 300 plus pounds. He's pretty tall as well. What you do see is length and explosiveness, which I think ties into the philosophy of how Brad Holmes also views building a defensive front. You see that with a lot of their pieces up front, right? Danico, you just see that. You see length, explosiveness upfield, not necessarily the biggest dudes. And when you do look at a guy like that, he's absolutely fits into that category. Murchison, another rookie. Again, I point this out. You could see the growth there in 2020 from year 1 to year 2, became a little bit more of an impact piece. Again, he was a round 5 pick, right? So just getting a little bit of something out of that is what you're hoping for, especially, in that second and third kind of year of their drafted deals. Teair Tart, right? Well-known, I think, interior defensive lineman. The guy was an undrafted free agent. Look at the success over the years from 2020 to 2022. The numbers continue to improve. They rose. The snaps also rose each year for Tart. So he's one of the guys that's pretty well known in the NFL as a nose tackle, and we've seen him play a lot of zero technique for Tennessee. He was a guy that continued to improve there.
I think what's awesome about Tart, I mean, he's recognized like a 3-tech coming out, been able to play some nose tackle within their defense. And again, this is an undrafted free agent. I mean, if anything, we just have, a way better version, I think, in Aleem McNeil and what he's been capable of, his ability to step inside, play like a nose tackle for us, play the one technique. A lot of times we saw in the playoffs as well against the San Francisco 49ers. We just have a better piece there, to be honest. And I think, again, you talk about the fit, more athletic, being able to win on the interior.
Danico Autry then arrived, and Danico Autry, of course, like he was, he was a guy, but Danico Autry arrives, and you can see 61 pressures his first season. That's 26 more than any point in his career, and again, then 54 the next season, so still very impactful. DeMarcus Walker, they added DeMarcus Walker. Again, some of these guys, snaps go up and stuff, but on only 400 snaps, the guy had 32 pressures in only 400 snaps. Rashad Weaver. Now, Rashad Weaver, I would say, didn't necessarily work out probably to what they would have hoped his first season. There was not a ton there, and then the second season, 34 pressures. A lot of that came with snaps. The next season didn't really get a lot of snaps, so I don't think that one necessarily worked out how maybe they would have hoped it would. Mario Edwards as well steps in. Mario Edwards, well known, had 34 pressures, most in his career. They also then, towards the end there, you add Arden Key to the mix. He's now playing his most snaps, puts up the second most pressures, and now all of a sudden you're looking at the lineup that they have defensively. Danico Autry, Harold Landry, Arden Key, Jeffrey Simmons. Now the death becomes Tart and Weaver. And what stands out to me with that is a lot of these additions, what I was trying to showcase is they happened along the way. Like, these weren't all at once. They kind of came along. You had role pieces in and out, right, that kind of mixed in. Maybe had career seasons, had really strong statistical seasons, were able to give some support. Obviously, you had some downtime there when at times those guys are maybe playing just too many snaps, right, or they're just young, but then they start to develop. And I think that's what you see with our defensive front. That's division, right? Levi took some massive steps this year just in terms of getting healthy. Aleem took off in kind of his new look role. Obviously, hit the way that he got in shape as well. Aiden Hutchinson had his best pass rushing season. He just took off this season, kind of that year two, just like, oh my goodness, that guy's an absolute animal as a pass rusher. James Houston, not as much, but that was mainly just because of the injury. I mean, if anything, Josh Paschal got more snaps. I don't think he took the big steps that they would have liked there. Broderick is now going into year two. You're hoping that, okay, full offseason, let's get this guy some snaps. So I think for the Lions, man, they're definitely going to be looking for someone that can step in, right, and probably help develop some of those interior, as a former nose tackle himself, help develop a piece like that in Broderick Martin, find a good spot, right? We saw the flexibility of our defensive front this past year. Aleem McNeil playing some of the one technique, playing nose tackle, sometimes playing one gap, other times playing gap and a half. And when we do some of those gap and a half fronts, that's where you want a guy like that to be very impactful. So I think for a piece like that, right, you're looking for that next step, who can really help get him there. And then you also flip it around. I think for Josh Paschal, John Kaminsky, specifically Josh Paschal, they're looking for the growth from that position. I think they're really looking for that growth. He's had really good edge rusher play. Some of that's also been investment, right? So can he help a little bit with, you know, the James Houstons and those pieces? Definitely, you hope so. But I think definitely the big DNs, right? The guys that physically are like long, maybe not the biggest dudes, but they're long, they're very explosive. Like, he's worked around those guys, and he's found a way to make some of those body types really work. And I think that's where you're looking for the big steps from that into year three. Like, okay, Josh, let's get it now. You're healthy. Let's get this thing rolling. When you look at it from a schematic spot of what he adds, I would say this. First off, and this is more of a numbers thing, but it's very important because over the last 3 seasons, and I just went back to the last 3 because that's since Aaron Glenn's been here, Lions have not been very good at stopping a quarterback in terms of putting up rushing stats. Now, some of that is design run, some of that is scrambles, some of that's not on the coaching staff, some of it is. But regardless, it hasn't been great, all right? And also some of that's your opponent. You play the Bears twice, Fields just runs. Like, that's what he does. If you don't play the Bears all the time, the numbers aren't always going to be the same. But they just haven't been great here statistically. They've been pretty bad. However, what you notice with Tennessee, with Terrell Williams, is consistently they've been very good at limiting the yards to a quarterback in terms of rushing, right? 5th in yards per game. Go back another year, 6th. Go back another year, tied for 7th. Very good. Consistently around 10th, right? Inside the top 10. And for the Lions there, obviously, you know, some of that you could point to kind of, you know, again, who is the running quarterback, and linebackers and other pieces play into that. But also, I think you point into, you know, kind of pass rush lanes. And you just saw the Brock Purdy game. You just saw the Niners. It killed us in the second half. Some of that was bad angles from linebackers. You know, but I think also you see, even when the pass rush lanes look pretty good, it's got to be really good. And at times the Lions had struggles with that in this last game where you just let a guy get out. And obviously teams like to utilize their quarterback's legs. So that's massive. And I think when I look at this, just that discipline alone, Lions, they're probably looking at that game like, yo, we got to lock this in. We got to dial this in, right? This needs to improve. Now, you do need that interior defensive line development. So I talk about Broderick, but Levi now being healthy going into the final year of his deal, can he take that next step? Can a guy with this experience give him and help him along that next step, right? Because he was a solid pass rusher this year. His run defense, I think it was up and down, but it improved as the year went on. Like, can he get the next step out of those guys? Because Alualu's not the future. Aleem, I think, proved himself. He's going to take off. Hutchinson's great, but that's not the future. So in the interior, but also like the guys like Josh Paschal going into year 3 now being healthy, like that's where you really want to see those jumps. On pass downs, you see a lot of things that will do. Even if it's not on pass down, you see the slant blitzing from the slot. They don't blitz a ton, at least this last year they didn't. But, you know, pass downs, you see them love to put speed over the guards, edge rusher step inside, and then again, you'll get those 3x1, 3x2 stunt looks from the front. But again, the big thing there is pass rush lane integrity, man, right? Being very fluid as a defensive front to not allow quarterbacks to take off because we don't play spies. So understanding that, having a guy that can kind of dial that in would be massive for the Lions, and that stats kind of speaks, I think, the most. When you see the way that they play stylistically, of course, you get a lot of defensive front looks from them, 5-man fronts, right? They kind of have your typical 3-4 look, but they'll play 4-man fronts just like we will. We'll do both as well. But what stands out is, schematically speaking, winning upfield, winning with explosiveness into your blocks, and that's obviously how the Lions want to play this. There's gap and a half rolls to that, but there's also single gapping rolls to that as well. Jack Campbell's playing Mike, right? He's taking the B gap. You're getting upfield. There's different roles to it, But the big thing is winning in that style, winning in that format with length, with power at the point of attack, but also not just closing my eyes and rushing a field, handling multiple gaps at time, playing B to A and A to B. Like, that's massive for the Lions. And I think this is a guy that, he's worked specifically most recently in the Titans in a defense that really prioritized things like that. And they were built around things like that. So that is Terrell Williams. And those are some of the things that I think he's going to add for us. I would keep an eye on the Lions adding a veteran, especially as like a pure pass rusher this offseason. He's been a part of a lot of that. But I think also, what really stands out is he's been able to get some things out of role players, some of the guys that have kind of just been moved on from, where it's like, that guy doesn't have it. And he's been able to have success, not insane success, but he's been able to get good stuff out of those role pieces, which eventually at some point in the season you always need. But then to me, it's really going to be about the development of a guy like Josh Paschal, right? Getting the consistency there, finding a role where he's very comfortable on this defensive front as well. He's been around. Teams wanted him as defensive coordinator. So getting him in a spot where he's very comfortable, kind of opening up his game as well, and kind of showing him how to win that way. So to me, man, this hiring makes a ton of sense. It absolutely does, right? Losing Todd Walsh was tough, but also not only do you get all this, you also get some of that potential Senior Bowl impact as well. So welcome Terrell Williams to the Lions. Excited to have him. And with that being said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.